Okay, well, I'm really pleased that Jason Porterfield has come with us to join us today. Jason lives there in Friendswood, and Jenny actually helped connect us. Last year, Jason released a book called Fight Like Jesus, and it is a discussion of Holy Week, and particularly reframes some of the things that may have bothered you for a long time, like Jesus making a whip of cords and driving money changers out of the temple. That one's always bothered me, and Jason's done some real good work to help unwind some of that, along with the rest of Holy Week. And so we're not pushing books, but Jason generously has brought books, if you don't have one, that he's willing to sell at cost. They're $10. They'll be $16 on Amazon, I think. So we're not pushing that, but I can tell you as a fellow author, this is a really good book to read. And particularly if you want a different view of Holy Week, it's lovely if you read it in tandem with Marcus Borg's book, The Last Week. Marcus Borg and John Dominic Crossan wrote the Last Week, which I highly recommend. It's Holy Week through Mark's eyes, very helpful. And then pairing Jason's book together just really opens up a lot of opportunities. And so what I've asked Jason to do is not only join us, share a little bit about what he's learned with us, so we're not going to ruin the book. Obviously, it's going to be worth your time to read and get deeper, but a few insights in the book. Maybe talk a little bit about what you learned in the writing process, and then open up for your questions and some conversation. So this is Jason.
Good to see you all. So, like Mike said, our mutual friend Jenny Scott. I don't know the correct terminology here, but my wife is a family doc. So after med school, you do 3 years of residency, then you can practice on your own. So I always thought of Jenny's role here as like priest residency, but I know.
Yeah, we use the word curate for that, and a curate is a priest who is sort of like being mentored before being cut free into the wild.
Yeah.
And so we get their gifts and they get ours.
Yeah.
And this is truly like the best parish, the mentor of praise, because people are thoughtful and generous and kind, and yeah, so they formed her well.
Yeah. I think that often years of spades, maybe all of that. Yeah. Oh, okay, there you go. Yeah. So Jenny and I were both with a missions organization called Servants, where everyone in Servants feels called to live and minister among the urban poor, and that was historically in the slums of Asia. So Jenny was initially in Calcutta, India, and then was on our team in Vancouver for a while, which has Canada's poorest neighborhood. And I did the opposite. I was in Vancouver first for a few years, and then helped start a new community in the slums of Indonesia. And so that's how Jenny and I know each other. So this book, if I can maybe tell just a little bit of the backstory to it real fast, and then we can kind of dive into some of the content. So when I moved into the downtown east side, that was the name of the neighborhood in Vancouver. You know, it's a very small neighborhood, 4 by 8 city blocks, but it is, you know, on any given night, there's an estimated 5,000 residents experiencing homelessness, drug addictions, and about 900 women trapped in prostitution. The United Nations, they once described the neighborhood as a 2-kilometer stretch of decaying rooming houses, seedy strip bars, and shady pawn shops. And elsewhere, they had one sentence about the downtown east side where they used the word notorious twice. I guess signifying how bad they thought the neighborhood was and how bad their writing is. You know, to use the same word twice. There's awful writing stuff for you. So I moved there, and I thought of myself as a peacemaker. You know, I had gone to a historically Anabaptist Christian college for my undergrad up in Pennsylvania. So this historic peace church tradition, a tradition, you know, when Jesus said, "Love your enemies," this tradition would tend to say that probably means don't kill them, you know. So I've been steeped in that sort of tradition. So I moved to the downtown east side, thinking of myself as a peacemaker. In other words, that's just a fancy way of saying I believe God was asking me to contend for the flourishing of this beautiful yet very broken community. But you know, honestly, it didn't take long before my neighborhood's brokenness broke me. The drugs just seemed so powerful. The poverty was so pervasive, and to top it all off, 3 weeks after I arrived, the news broke that out-of-town pig farmer named Robert Picton had just confessed to killing 49 women from my neighborhood. And so it didn't take long before I felt like a family of a peacemaker. I didn't know how to make peace, right? I mean, don't get me wrong, I knew Jesus' peace teaching like the back of my hand, blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you, bless those who curse you. Go the extra mile, turn the other cheek, do not violently resist an evil person, right? I could quote it verbatim. My problem was, I didn't know how to apply it, at least not within the messiness and complexity of a place like the downtown east side. And I think, you don't have to live in a place like the downtown east side to have your heart break over injustice and to long to be used by God to cultivate his shalom in places where it's painfully absent. And so perhaps like you long to make a positive difference in the world, but you feel ill-equipped and you don't know where to begin, right? Yeah. And that's really what birthed this book, because I've come to believe that if you want to know how Jesus makes peace, if you want to be equipped to effectively be a practitioner of Jesus' approach to peacemaking, then there's actually no better place to look than Holy Week. Why? A third of the Gospels focus on Jesus' last week. And so it is the main stage on which we get to put all of his previous peace teaching into action. Does that make sense? So, in other words, we get to see him apply it, which is what I needed to see, right? So, throughout those sacred days, we get to see formally abstract principles like be merciful, define concrete expression, and those lofty ethical ideals, love your enemies, they become grounded in actual events. Does that make sense? Yeah. So, let me just give a sampling of what that looks like from Holy Week. So the book goes day by day. Extracting peacemaking lessons for us and how Jesus confronts injustice, called out oppressors, and defended from each day, right? And it really, it just, the motivation for the book came from hitting rock bottom and dragging myself to church while I was still in the downtown east side, and it turned out to be Palm Sunday. And I'm guessing your church is much like many churches where people enjoy occasion, right? You got the palm branches, kids parade through chanting Hosanna, right? All the songs are in a major key and a minor chord all of a sudden, right? And I was just in no mood to participate on that particular Palm Sunday. So I remember crying out to God and he was failure of peacemaker. Teach me how to make peace. I have no idea how to do that in this neighborhood. And so this was a Baptist church. So when the pastor got up to deliver his feel-good message, I just thought, gospel counts all Sunday. So I flipped to the Gospel of Luke, and that's when I noticed something I had never noticed. It says that while the crowds were shouting cheers as Jesus made his triumph entry into the city, Jesus was shedding tears. And when you can hold back his grief no more, he cries out for everyone to hear. If only you knew the things that make for peace. That's my prayer. That's what I just prayed. Teach me the things that make for peace, right there, And it's interesting that it's things in the plural. I grew up in a tradition, at least, that wanted to reduce Jesus' peacemaking efforts to one solitary act, the cross. And it's certainly the culmination of how Jesus makes peace. But I've come to believe that Jesus was crucified on Friday precisely because of how he contended for peace. And if we fail to recognize that, then I think the great tragedy is we can cling to the cross of Christ for our salvation, yet embrace the very approach to peacemaking that justified him to the cross. Does that make sense? Approach to peacemaking or peacemaking that justifies executing. And so that was really the motivation behind the book. So let me give an example, or maybe a couple of quick examples, and then put it up in Q&A. You mentioned the Temple Cleansing on Monday, so maybe we can talk about that as well. So Palm Sunday, I've already mentioned this lament, only you do the things that make for peace. Well, there's more to the day. So what we call the Holy Week, for Jesus and his contemporaries, was known as the week-long Passover festivities. Does anyone remember what Passover is about? It's this time where you,
Exodus. Yeah. They mark the miracles of the door and God to attack our other nations.
Yeah,
To spare the, Jews.
yeah, perfect. And the end result was the people of Israel get their liberation from Egypt, right?
Yes.
They get to leave. And so, you know, religious pilgrims would flood to Jerusalem and the population of Jerusalem would triple during Passover. And, you know, it's this religious festival to remember the time God won their liberation from the superpower of Egypt. But yet they're once again under the yoke of an oppressive empire, Rome. So it doesn't take much imagination to realize that the week actually would sometimes spark thoughts of gaining your liberation again, right? May God do it once again what he did once before, right? So the week actually had a track record of inciting all-out insurrection. 4 BC, a group of frustrated Jews stoned to death some Roman soldiers, and Herod Archelaus came in and killed crucified 3,000 Jews, canceled that year's Passover. And after that, Rome said, from now on, our provincial ruler of Judea has to be there, Jerusalem, and bring reinforcements. You know, it's peace through force, or at least the threat of force as a deterrent, right? And so, on this particular Passover, Pontius Pilate leaves his home on the coast of the Mediterranean, Caesarea Maritima, and marches. He marches eastward and brings reinforcements. He comes in through the western gate of Jerusalem. But we read that Jesus and his motley crew are entering from the other side of the city. And John's gospel tells us the crowds go out to meet him precisely because they heard he had raised Lazarus from the dead. So suddenly, you know, this thought of, hey, Pontius Pilate, you know, soldiers and swords and chariots and war horses, but what power do such trifles have over a miracle worker who can control death itself? So the crowds rush out to meet Jesus, right? And it says they do 4 things. They chant Hosanna. They quote a psalm, Psalm 118, a verse from that. They lay their coats on the ground and they wave palm branches. So let me give a quick rundown of that. Hosanna. I always thought that was like a word of adoration, like hallelujah, like synonymous with that. But it's actually the Aramaic form of a 2-part Hebrew word, Hoshea and Na. Hoshea means save us, liberate us, deliver us. And Na adds a sense of urgency on the end. So it literally means liberate us, we plead, save us, we pray, deliver us now. They quote a psalm, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. But then they add a few words not found anywhere in the psalm. The King of Israel. It says they lay their coats on the ground, which might seem strange to you and I. You know, now my coats are going to get all dirty. But that was a customary way to coronate a new king. Yeah. That's what they did when Jehu was crowned king in 2 Kings chapter 9, for example. And finally, the palm branches. Now, I always thought palm branches were like the ancient equivalent of those giant foam hands at sporting event. Like I thought, wait a minute, like I'm your number 1 fan, right? It's not at all what they mean, actually. Palm branches were actually a politically loaded symbol that reminded the Jewish people of an event that happened almost exactly 200 years before. And at that time, the people of Judea were under the yoke of a different empire, the Seleucid Empire. Their king came in and ransacked the temple, slaughtered a pig on the altar, an unclean animal, and sprinkled his blood throughout the temple. Then this king ordered all the towns of Judea to offer sacrifices to his gods. And he sent inspectors to make sure this happened. Well, in the little town of Redim, there was an old Jewish priest named Mattathias. And when one of his fellow countrymen offered to make sacrifices to the Seleucid gods, out of zeal for God, it says, he lunges forward, stabs the apostate to death, kills the king's inspector, tears down the altar, flees to the hills, and starts to gather recruits. Soon after, his health deteriorates, and so he gathers his 5 sons around him, and his dying words to his sons are these: avenge the wrong done to your people, pay back the Gentiles in full. How's that for some dying words? So his middle son, Judas, picks up this battle cry, and he leads a surprisingly successful revolt against the Seleucid Empire to get back most of Jerusalem, including the temple. And as he rides into Jerusalem for a triumphal entry and proceeds to then cleanse the temple, this might sound familiar, right? It says that the crowds waved, can you guess it? Yeah, not giant palm branches, palm branches, yes. Palm branches then became the symbol of the Jewish people's desire to gain their freedom. We know this because, so Judas, you may remember his last name, although it's actually not his last name, Judas Maccabeus. He was so fierce in battle, that's actually a nickname they give him, and Maccabeus means the hammer. So I always picture like Thor, or there's something, every city has one of those lawyers that, auto action lawyers that has the hammer that brings down.
Oh, what is it? Chip Adler?
Jim,
Yeah, that's the takeaway. Yeah. So he gets that nickname because he's so fierce in battle. They think they're going to get their independence, and they kind of do for a good while. And so they start minting their own coins, and on the coins they put a palm. That's their symbol, and they circle it with the battle cry for the redemption of Zion. And even after the time of Jesus, there's two Jewish-Roman wars that occur where the Jewish people think we're going to get our independence back. And so once again, they start minting their own coins. And once again, the symbol they use for their independence is the palm.
I've got one.
Say again?
I've got one
There you go.
on my ring.
Yeah.
The palm symbol from the Bar Kokhba revolt.
Yes. So when the crowds wave palm branches, in other words, they're not saying you're awesome, Jesus. They're saying it functioned like the ancient equivalent of like a separatist movement's flag would today, right? Saying we desire to be free from Rome, hence Hosanna, deliver us, liberate us, save us. And waving them at Jesus meant we think you're the one who's going to lead the liberation, the rebellion, right? Now, I don't think Jesus was surprised that the crowds thought he was coming in the likeness of Judas Maccabeus to bring a hammer down upon the Romans. And so he actually, the way he scripted his triumphal entry, or not so triumphal entry, is just brilliant. I think it's some of the best street theater in human history. So there's Mark's gospel, which Marcus Borg and Crossman's book the last week focuses on Mark's gospel. Mark dedicates half of his coverage of Palm Sunday to this preparatory act, getting the donkey, right? But we read that it's at the height of when the crowds are doing those four things that Jesus decides to ride the donkey. And thankfully, John's gospel has an important little parenthetical aside for the reader where he says, and here's why Jesus rode a donkey. It was to fulfill Zechariah's vision in Zechariah 9, chapter 9, verses 9 and 10, that speaks of a peaceable king who will ride in on a donkey. And this king will bring peace to all nations, not just to his nation. And in fact, it says he'll remove the weapons of war from his own people, right? So that John tells us that's why he rode a donkey, right? The symbol of peace. But there's more to the day. I think that's what we tend to focus on, right? The timing and the location are also brilliant. Jesus entered on the first day of Passover, which was the 10th day of the Jewish month of Nisan. And according to the Torah, this is the day when all the religious pilgrims were to choose their lamb. It was lamb selection day. And we know from historical records that the lambs were supplied from Bethlehem. And the route that Jesus took, once he goes down the Mount of Olives, crosses the Kidron Valley, lines up with the route that the sheep could have taken. And he almost certainly entered through what was known as the sheep gate. That would be the obvious gate to enter into Jerusalem. So here Jesus is subtly, yet unambiguously saying, I'm not coming as the hammer of God. I'm coming as the Lamb of God, right? And so for me, something else to point out, Jesus says as he's making his way to Jerusalem, he tells his disciples, I'm going to die there. He knows conflict is going to happen there in Jerusalem, which is a little ironic. I mean, Jerusalem, it's the city whose name literally means peace. And so when I think about peacemaking, what does Palm Sunday teach, for example? Well, it teaches that we move towards conflict first and foremost, not running away from it. And it teaches that, like Jesus's lament, we need to allow our hearts to be so moved by injustice that it brings us to tears. It's only the second time we read of Jesus weeping in the Gospels. And then as we move towards conflict and allow that conflict to just break our hearts, I think the third thing Palm Sunday teaches us is that as we enter into that conflict, we must lay aside our hammers and embrace the way of the Lamb. So let me just fast forward to Friday, and then I think I can open it up to discussion and talk about any particular other events from Holy Week. So come Friday, well, let me back up to Thursday evening. They're in the garden, right? The mob comes to arrest Jesus. And I always thought that's when the disciples fled. When the mob comes to arrest Jesus armed with clubs and swords. But that's not what it says. Like good Texas boys, they stand their ground. They ask Jesus, should we fight? They don't wait for an answer because the answer is obvious. So Peter pulls out his sword, chops off the servant's ear, right? So in other words, they didn't go looking for a fight, but they weren't going to back down from one either, right? But then Jesus, he heals the servant's ear, and he tells Peter, put your sword away, for all who draw the sword will die by the sword. In other words, all who seek to advance their agenda in the world through violence will be consumed by violence, right? And Peter Hubbard, a professor out on the West Coast, he said, this is not the time is not right kind of prohibition. This is the time is never right kind of prohibition. And the early church really picked up on that. Tertullian said, in disarming Peter, Christ disarmed every soldier. Interesting, right? But it's then that the disciples believe. Not when the mob showed up. They were ready to fight then. They were willing to fight to their death. But when Jesus refused to let them use violence, it says that's when they believed him. And in fact, one of the gospels says that one of the Jesus followers flees naked. It seems a little odd, right? Until we remember that it says at the start of the gospels that disciples left everything to follow Jesus. And now we see one disciple literally leaving everything to flee from Jesus. He didn't turn out to be who he thought Jesus would be. Come Friday morning, he's standing before Pontius Pilate. And Pilate, other historical, he seems kind of nice in the gospel. Other historical records describe him as pretty cruel, but also pretty calculated. And so most likely, you may remember he offered a choice to the crowds. Who should I release to you, Barabbas or Jesus? And most likely it was a way to placate the Jewish crowds during a week when tensions were high, this tradition of offering to release someone. Well, you can't understand that choice, I think, unless you understand why Barabbas was in jail and the significance of his name. Because this is the choice that all of us have to make, I think. That's why it's described in all four Gospels. This is an important choice. So as to the crime, Barabbas was not in jail for a petty misdemeanor or tax evasion. No, it says he was in jail because he murdered someone during a past insurrection attempt. Most likely a Roman soldier. So, in other words, Barabbas had proven his willingness to bring a hammer down upon the Romans. I mean, yes, he was a failed insurrectionist, but at least he had proven his willingness to fight. Now, to his name, let me pronounce his name a little differently. Barabbas. Do you hear any word in there that you know?
Abba.
Abba, which means?
Father.
Father, right. Barabbas, it means son of the Father. And Matthew's gospel actually tells us his first name. Jesus. Here we have two competing claims for a Messiah. Who do you think is anointed by God? Who do you want to be the anointed one? You choose. The one who's proven his willingness to bring a hammer down upon the Romans, or the one who is saying he refuses to fight? You might remember Jesus said to Pontius Pilate, if my kingdom was of this world, my followers would fight. Right. It's not, right? And I think that's the choice each of us have to make. And I think the great tragedy throughout church history is too often we think we've embraced Jesus, but we've embraced the wrong Jesus. We're still embracing the way of Jesus Barabbas. It was a hard word. And then, I think we have to see ourselves in the crowds here. So when we realize that Jesus the Nazarene would not pick up a hammer and bring it down upon our enemies, we picked up the hammer. We nailed Jesus to a cross. Do you remember what his dying words were?
Forgive them, for they know not what they do.
Very first words, many traditions, I'm going to guess your church tradition focus on the 7 last words of Jesus, right? The first words. His instinctive response when we drive nails to him. Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. I think we're meant to see those words in juxtaposition with Mattathias's dying words. Avenge the wrong done to your people, pay back the Gentiles in full. And those dying words sparked a violent revolution. Many of Jesus's dying words, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And I think those dying words also sparked a revolution, albeit a non-violent one. So that's a quick overview. Let me open it up. We can talk about the temple cleansing or any other events if you want, but
I have a question.
Yeah.
Where did Peter get the sword? I didn't expect any of them to have weapons ever.
yeah. So, when I wrote this book, I did not write it to be apologetic in nature, in the sense of trying to address the concerns that those who don't hold to a nonviolent peace ethic raise. But it's interesting that two of the main passages that they bring up are temple cleansing, and then at the very end on Thursday in the upper room, it's only in Luke's gospel, but Jesus actually tells them to buy swords. To buy swords. Let me read the passage for you. I get it word for word here. Then Jesus said to them, when I sent you without purse, bag, or sandals, did you lack anything? Nothing, they answered. He said to them, but now if you have a purse, take it, and also a bag. And if you don't have a sword, sell your cloak and buy one. For it is written, and he was numbered with the transgressors. And I tell you that this must be fulfilled in me. Yes, what is written about me is reaching its fulfillment. The disciples said, see, Lord, here are 2 swords. That's enough, he replied. Very interesting scene, right? So, there is a sad history of Christian leaders using this passage to justify Christians' right to bear arms and justifying some pretty horrific violent acts. And so to point out a few things with this passage, first of all, it's interesting that Jesus says that's enough about with 2 swords. So they don't actually buy them. There's 2 swords there, right, in the upper room with them. And if Jesus meant for these swords to be used for self-defense, it's hard to understand how 2 swords could be enough to defend 12 men from attack, right? Plus, when Peter uses one of the swords in self-defense, Jesus rebukes his act, right? So it's pretty easy to poke a hole in the violent interpretations of this, but you still have to ask, why did Jesus want his disciples to have swords, right? So pacifists, I've usually heard 2 answers to that. The first is to say, well, they weren't actually swords. The Greek word makairon, it actually refers to a short dagger. These were cooking knives. And the reason there were 2 cooking knives in the upper room is because they would have needed carving knives for the cooked Paschal lamb, Clever interpretation, until it falls apart when you realize that it says, when the mob comes out to the garden, they're armed with clubs and the exact same type of sword. And I don't think they showed up to compete in the barbecue cook-off, right? So that falls apart. So the other interpretation, it came about 100 years ago, a Scottish theologian who said, well, actually, Jesus' words at the end, that's enough. It should actually be translated, enough of this. Like Jesus is frustrated that his disciples misunderstood him once again. His comment about getting swords was sarcasm, or at most some sort of metaphor that they misunderstood. But I mean, one, I think we should be a little wary of interpretations that it took 1900 years before the church got it right? We should be a little wary of that. But also, it's really hard to bend the Greek to actually have it being a rebuke, enough of this. But on top of that, Jesus would have had to have been the poorest of communicators in the world to say, remember that time I sent you literally without purse or sandal? Well, now I'm going to speak metaphorically, shift, without even telling you, right? So I don't think any of those explanations hold ground, right? So what I say in the book is, Jesus actually says in this passage in Luke why he wants his disciples to acquire swords. And here's what it was. If you don't have a sword, sell your cloak and buy one. For, that's gar in the Greek, or because, for it is written, and he was numbered with the transgressors. Now, the Greek word there for transgressors is anamos, nomos meaning law, the little prefix meaning like outside of, or, and so we tend to think of transgressors in a very spiritual sense, sinners. But what it's literally saying is, or he will be counted among those outside the law. He'll be counted among the outlaws. He'll be counted among the lawless. Or as the New Living Translation says, he will be counted among the rebels. And suddenly it starts to make sense. 2 swords aren't enough to defend a group of 12 from attack, but they are enough to justify the claim that he was leading a violent rebellion. Fast forward to the garden, and that's precisely what the mob thinks. They come armed with weapons because they believe they're going to need to use those weapons to arrest him. And Jesus even says that. He says, am I leading a rebellion? Same word. Am I leading a rebellion that you have come here with swords and clubs? So why does Jesus have his disciples acquire swords? Well, it was to fulfill that prophecy that he was counted among the outlaws, the rebels. But why? Why do that? Why was it so important to fulfill that prophecy, right? Well, it seems that it was because it gave him a chance to once and for all unambiguously forbid the use of violence. Remember what he says to Peter? And to do so while he can still undo the damaging effects of that violence. He heals the servant's ear. That's, I think, at least you don't have to agree with it, but that's my best attempt to be faithful to the text there. That was a long answer.
Thank you.
What else do we got?
Well, I wonder if I could invite you to consider, and this is like totally wackadoo, that maybe there's like actually kind of, I don't want to say only 2, I don't like believe in either ors, but there are sort of like different kinds of violence in the natural world.
Okay.
And when I think about this along sort of like traditional masculine, feminine terms, masculine violence tends to be pretty destructive, right? Assertion, control. But I'll tell you, probably the most violent thing I've ever seen in my life is the birth of my daughter. But it was creative violence.
Yeah.
And very much absorbed and self-contained in a woman's body. And I think that happens even when there's a stillbirth. So it's not like this always works amazingly, but like birthing is violent. My wife even said for a long time, she was like, I'm never having a baby because a baby is like a virus. Like it takes all of your nutrients, it steals from your body. And like, I'm not sure she's completely wrong, right? But I just want to say, like, there's very different outcomes between, like, there's no like natural violence that's like masculine, that is creative. I don't mean like men can't do anything. I don't mean it like that. But I wonder if there aren't different ways to think about violence, and we typically think in the masculine category in which there's nothing creative. And I don't know if that has any like sparks anything in you at all.
Well, certainly in different historic peace church traditions, they do sometimes try to give some nuance on what do they mean by non-violence. You know, could force be used, but in a way that's working for ultimately to protect and not destroy the person that maybe, you know, an elderly man comes to rob the store, and you're young and fit, you just kind of hold them. You say there's support, right? Like, or we had a teammate in Vancouver who through a stressful week triggered a bipolar episode, went manic, first time, right? And we kind of had to force her into the backseat of the car to take her to the hospital and the psych ward. And you could say that was violence, but you could also say, but it's forced to do it, ultimately caring for what's best for her. I think the best example from Holy Week is the temple cleansing of this. You know, it says in Mark's gospel that Jesus actually goes into the temple the night before. That's how Palm Sunday ends. And he looks around and he assesses the situation. He sees what's going on there. And then he goes back to Bethany for the night. So in other words, when he returns on Monday, he doesn't just snap. He doesn't have a temple tantrum, right? He's had time to pray and think about how to respond. So we read that once he was already in the temple, he makes a whip out of cords, is how it's often translated. Sconion. It's rushes or reeds is the material. So I actually, when I learned what he made it out of, I actually went on Amazon, bought a 200-foot roll of this sort of material. And with my kids, we watched actually Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, I also would recommend watching it. But trying to make the most intimidating whips we could, great father-child activity. And I have to tell you, if Jesus' whip was anything like my whip, like the people would have just fallen over laughing instead of fleeing in fear. Like it's really hard to make an intimidating whip out of that material. And in fact, the two earliest manuscripts of John's Gospel, which is the only gospel that mentions the whip, he uses the little Greek word hos, which means to approximate something. So like when Jesus sweat something like blood, that's a little Greek word hos. So in other words, it seems like even John is admitting this was kind of a pseudo whip. A whip of sorts, But either way, what we know for sure is this was not a well-designed instrument of torture made by a skilled craftsman with plenty of time and choice material, right? This was hastily constructed from a pretty bad material for making a whip out of, right? And the prevailing theory is that it was actually the animal bed. Otherwise, it's hard to explain what this material was. And actually, again, John's Gospel is the only one that mentions the whip. And it's actually quite clear in the Greek. I was shocked at how clear it was. It says, if I translated it like literal, word for word, it says, "And making the whip out of the cords, he drove out of the temple all." And then it has this phrase, "To the sheep, kai the cattle." Kai just means and. To is usually like a logical connector, like it usually gets translated so. Drove out of the temple all, so the sheep and the cattle, right? So sometimes when you translate, you go word for word, but other times you look at how a phrase is used, right? So I looked in the New Testament at how every time there's a to noun, kai noun phrase used to modify a word, just like in that verse, it modifies the word all. And I wanted to see how is it translated. Well, I'm not the only person to do this. A number of scholars have. It's used 90 times in the New Testament, and every other time it's used to tell us what the word it modifies consists of. It lists the parts that make up the whole. So he baptized both Jews and Greeks, right? That would be to the Jews, kai the Greeks. There's actually 13 instances in the New Testament of a to noun, kai noun phrase modifying the word all, exactly like it does in the key verse in John. So, I mean, it's just a grammatical parallel, perfect match, right? And in every one of those instances, it tells us what the all is comprised of. So in other words, that's a lengthy answer to say, you'd have to translate the Greek in John's Gospel in a way it's not translated any of the other 90 times to have it say that Jesus whipped people. In other words, you'd have to have it say, "And making a whip out of cords, he drove out of the temple all, along with the sheep and the cattle," right? That's the only way to have it, that he whipped the money changers and the animal sellers. So I point out that there's a number of other factors, like when they try to bring up false accusations against Jesus on Thursday night. If he had whipped people, surely that would have been some incriminating evidence, but they don't even bring that up. So there's a lot of factors like that, right? So at most, though, that neutralizes the passage. But I wanted to show how this actually advances our understanding of how Jesus makes peace. And so I point out that, kind of like, let's say a mother comes home from work, she gets up early, she walks into the house and she sees her teenage son and his friends are high on drugs. Well, if I was that mother, I'd snap into action. I'd grab the drugs off the coffee table, flip over the coffee table, go into the bathroom, pour the drugs into the toilet, flush it down the drain, come out, look at my son and his friends in the eyes and give them a good tongue lashing, right? Your bodies are made in the image of God, stop destroying them, right? Well, was the mother angry, assertive, aggressive? Yeah, but we say she was negligent if she didn't act, right? That's what love required. And that's what I see of Jesus in the temple. Was he angry, assertive, and aggressive? Was he violent? Could it potentially fit that definition? Yeah, I suppose you could say that, but that's what a loving God does. The temple cleansing shows us not that Jesus was violent, but that he wasn't passive. He refused to sit idly by and do nothing when he saw the money changers and the animal sellers exploiting the poor and marginalizing foreigners. There's so much more we could say on that, but I'll just bring out one last point. We almost always overlook the part of the story that says after Jesus drove out the sheep and the cattle and the animal sellers went running after their livelihood, right? It says that the lame and the blind came in and Jesus healed them, and children could even be heard singing. Here are three groups who were not allowed in the temple. And so we usually focus on what we think of as a destructive act, but actually Jesus' actions on Monday were constructive. They brought about healing. So does that kind of answer your question? I don't know how we're doing on time, but
We've got 15 minutes.
great. Any other questions?
What prompted you to write this book about the Holy Week?
Yeah, well, I was sitting in that church on Palm Sunday, and when I saw that lament, I just felt like God said to me, if you want to become an effective peacemaker in the downtown east side, then study the greatest peacemaker's greatest week. And so, as a book nerd, the first thing I did was try to find other books that did that, and I couldn't find any that looked at Holy Week that way. And so it just Holy Week kind of became my training manual to know. Like I said, I went to a historically Anabaptist college, and especially a century ago, like the Mennonite and Brethren in Christ circles, there was a lot of debate about when we say nonviolence, do we mean non-resistance, like we do nothing, you know, or does it mean we are actively kind of like more like Gandhi or Dr. King, right? And when you look just at the Sermon on the Mount, I can see why you have that debate. But when you look at Jesus during Holy Week, I think it would be hard to argue that he was about non-resistance, not doing anything. I mean, Jesus resisted evil with every fiber of his being. He just did it with, he overcame evil with good. So, right? So that was the motivation, was for my own self, and then wanting to help other churches learn from the greatest peacemakers, greatest week.
I just wanted to say that we have a women's forum on Zoom once a week, and we're studying a book. What's the name of it? The Passion. Women of the Passion. Okay, and it's written from the point of view of the different women that Jesus comes in contact with in his walk to the cross, including Pontius's wife. And it's very, very powerful. It's in the first person, and it's how these women feel in their interactions with Jesus in that week. So I recommend the book to anybody.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, 2 days stand out for me as far as women during Holy Week. On Wednesday, the Sanhedrin, the ruling council of the Jews, which Rome actually appointed members of the Sanhedrin and appointed who the high priest was. They meet in Caiaphas's house, the high priest, to plot how can we kill Jesus, right? But at the same time that they're meeting in the halls of power, Jesus is in the home of a leper named Simon. And the story is really not about Simon. In fact, we don't even find out if Jesus heals him, you know. They're having a meal, and an unnamed woman comes in, and she breaks open an alabaster flask, pure nard, very expensive perfume, only found from the Himalaya, made from plants from the Himalayan mountains. She pours it over Jesus' head, right? And then the disciples start berating her, this waste of money, right? And Jesus defends her, and I'll just read what I said. So I wrote it better than I could say it now. Even in the brief glimpse we've been given into this woman's life, we witnessed her being marginalized in multiple ways. No one asked for her name, no one offered her a seat at the table, and her hesitancy to speak in the presence of men was matched only by the disciples' lack of hesitancy to speak out against her. Yet from her vantage point, having been pushed to the margins of society, this unnamed woman saw what Jesus' disciples could not. For it's no coincidence that the first person to foresee how Jesus would be silenced and rejected by society was a woman who routinely endured the same treatment. My friend Kristen Jack likes to say, where you stand determines what you see. It's his way of explaining the power of perspective. This act, normally you would anoint a king with oil by pouring it over their head. And nard was reserved usually for preparing bodies for burial. So this unnamed woman, it seems that she was the first to recognize Jesus as the anointed one, as king, yet at the same time to realize he's gonna die. I know, pretty profound. In some ways you could say she is the first Christian, you know. Similarly, on Sunday, the first evangelists are the 5 or more women that we read, who receive the new message of the resurrection, and they go back to the disciples, and the disciples don't believe them. You know, perhaps because their testimony was hard to believe, but also probably because they doubted the testimony of the one, you know, the women, right? So there's much to learn from going to the Holy Week. Yeah, thank you for bringing that up.
Can you talk a little bit about your primary resources for researching the book?
So the last week is a great one. You know, I mean, you could look at the footnotes in the, I mean, it was probably 150 scholarly articles or books like the last week. So yeah, I mean, then looking at the Greek too, let me think of how to answer that. Let me add this. This doesn't quite answer your question, but one of the things I was surprised, you know, there's a handful of books that do what this does in the sense of going day by day through the Holy Week. You know, there's probably 20 or 30 that I, you know, read and referenced. But the surprising thing was almost all of them dedicate 80 or 90% of their coverage to Thursday evening through Easter Sunday. And that makes sense. We want to jump ahead to the main event, right? What I was shocked though about is that the gospel writers do the opposite. They front load their coverage of Holy Week. You know, pop quiz. Which day of Holy Week received the most attention in the gospel? Monday, okay, no. 7 more days to choose from, Palm Sunday through Easter Sunday. I mean, that's a good guess. I pretty much thought that.
The big teaching block's on Tuesday.
Okay, the big teaching. You should have been last.
That's where he takes on all the arguments, right? I mean, that's.
Yes, so the most talked about day of Jesus' life is Tuesday of Holy Week. But other than Reverend Mike, who of us can name a single thing that happened on Tuesday of Holy Week? None of us. So how do we know nothing about the most talked about day of the most important week in the most important person's life, right? I think it's because we jump ahead. You know, growing up in a, like you talked about this morning, growing up in an evangelical tradition that I grew up in, you know, we think we're making much of the cross. We lift up the cross, and I think in our passion to lift it up, we fail to realize that we've just uprooted it from its context, and we've severed it from the life of the one who gives it meaning. So we think we're making much of the cross, but we're actually diminishing its significance. And so I tried in the book at least to give good bit of time to the first half of Holy Week. So Tuesday is my longest chapter because Tuesday is the longest day in the Gospels, for example. That doesn't quite answer your question, but it sparked that thought.
Maybe I could ask you if you're familiar with Walter Wink.
Yes.
So see, this is a really interesting treatment we read a couple of years ago about Jesus as a non-violent, resisting non-violently, based on if somebody strikes you, turn the other cheek. If somebody demands your tunic, give them also your cloak. No, cloak, give them your tunic. And you know, if somebody demands you walk 1 mile, go another mile. And Walter Wink does something really brilliant with this, I think, which is sort of like looks at how Gandhi read that and how Martin Luther King Jr. and said, like, this isn't pacifism, this is nonviolent resistance. And that's sort of a frame that I think works really well for what you do with Holy Week as well.
Yeah. You want standing up?
I
I can
did.
get off the video. Where's your right cheek?
This one.
This one. So if I'm gonna hit Mike.
This is what Walter Wink does, right?
This is what Walter Wink does. If I'm gonna hit Mike on the right cheek, well, I'm right-handed. So how, that's. You know, like it's really awkward. Well, the way it most likely happened is in culture back then, or like when I lived, where I lived in Indonesia, you don't use your left hand. So you use it for certain other.
For wiping,
I won't make-
right.
Yes, for wiping, thank you. Didn't know if I should say that in
It's
here.
okay.
So
We're a
the way
Episcopal.
to hit on the right cheek with a backhanded slap. It's a way of saying things. It's a way of saying you are inferior to me. It's what a master would do to a slave, for example. So when Jesus says turn the other cheek, it's almost like he's saying, that didn't work. I refuse to let you say that I am less than you. For I am also created in the image of God. If you're gonna hit me again, now you gotta hit me as an equal with a fist. Right? Does that make sense? So, it's Jesus, this is at least Wing's interpretation, which I think has some validity. And going the second mile does something like this too. They take your cloak, give you your tunic. In other words, you're gonna walk out of there naked.
Stark naked.
Yeah, and the one humiliated is the one who forced you to be naked, right? Not you. So it's a way of non-violently, but yet creatively, refusing to let the oppressor treat you as less than human. Yeah.
And this is how King, in a march from Selma to Montgomery, you get sprayed with a hose and you get up and you walk again. And the dog gets on you and you get up and you walk again. You don't fight the dog, you don't flee, you don't do nothing. You do this march, right? Just public, and yeah, it takes a lot of strength. Can I ask you a couple of last questions, and then we have a couple of minutes?
Okay.
And you don't have to take any of them on. And if you want to make a closing statement, please, by all means. Let's talk about hymns like Onward Christian Soldiers and militaristic, frankly, co-opted violent terms that have informed the church militant and the church triumphant. And if you have anything to say about that, or maybe just, hey, look, we live in increasingly anxious times, right? There's Ukraine and there's Russia. And typically what we say is Russia's the bad actor. None of us, I think, really know how to make for peace. I'm just going to be honest. Like, what do we actually do as individuals? I would say the same with political violence, right? I mean, apparently we're looking for some kind of event this Tuesday, right? And so, like, how is it that you think that ways to engage? So I don't know if either of those interest you, and if not, talk about something else.
Okay, in 3 minutes or less, I'll.
3 minutes or less, that's what we got.
First thing I'll say is on Thursday in the upper room, Jesus gives a new love command. A new command I give to y'all, to use Texas language, it's you in the plural. New command I give to y'all, y'all love each other because I have loved y'all. And it's the first time, part of why it's new is it's the first time that Jesus has called his followers to commit themselves to each other, to commit to forming communities that are committed to loving each other as Christ has loved them. And the beauty of communities, it creates a space into which you can welcome others to not just hear about God's love or see it, but to actually experience God's love. The reason I bring that up first is because I think when it comes to cultivating peace or shalom in places where it's painfully absent, it takes communities of Christians to figure out what is that going to look like to do that in our specific locality. So the short answer is, that's for my church to figure out in Friendswood, it's for your church to figure out here, right? So I can't just tell you the answer. What's it going to look like come Tuesday if things turn violent, here in Nassau Bay. But that said, let's see, what was the first thing you brought up?
Militaristic use in like liturgy, right? Honor Christian soldiers.
Yeah, well, there's certainly militaristic metaphors in scripture, right? Paul uses some, but the early church didn't see that as a call to turn violent. I mean, they were staunch pacifists. There's not a single Christian writing for the first 300 years in which the writer approves of Christians behaving violently. But certainly after Constantine, there begins to be more and more people who take that militaristic language and start to apply it in not just a spiritual battle, but Saint Bernard of Clairvaux takes the temple cleansing and says, repel the foes of Christ, for our Savior armed his most holy hands with a whip. So they start to say, okay, this gives us justification to actually be violent towards others. The church that I grew up in was a very patriotic, nationalistic church. I once was asked to speak there on Veterans Day, so me, the lone pacifist. And I didn't realize that Veterans Day is like 2 days before, so it was like too late to say, get someone else. And so that service, a third of the congregation were dressed in military uniforms. Numerous nationalistic hymns, like the one you mentioned, was sung. Pledging of allegiance to the American flag, a Christian flag. Then an offertory video while they collected the offering that culminated with a silhouette of Calvary's Hill with 3 crosses, and then 3 military warplanes flying overhead, coloring the sky with a trail of red, white, and blue smoke. And then it was my turn to preach. And I wish, this is not a tradition that focuses on saints from church history, but I wish they did know their church history, because the church has historically paused on November 11th. I actually remember the life of a Christian military deserter, St. Martin of Tours, who said, "I am a Christian, it is impermissible for me to fight." You know, I wish they'd known that, but, getting to Ukraine, you know, I mean, it's hard. I think above all, we need to listen to Christians in Ukraine and in Russia, and try to be supportive. Like you said, donating blood, you know, small acts that we can do. I do find it interesting that in 2015, the university in Kyiv did a national survey in Ukraine that asked if a foreign superpower invades our country, how should we respond? And the most popular answer, and I'm sure everyone was thinking about Russia, because the annexation of Crimea had just happened.
Right.
The most popular answer was nonviolent direct resistance. So that tells me there's at least a culture there of seeing nonviolent means as successful. And two scholars, Ivy League scholars, Stephen and Chenoweth, they wrote a book, Why Civil Resistance Works. And they looked at the history of conflicts from 1900 to 2006. And they found that nonviolent direct resistance was twice as effective as violent means to bring about peace. And even when it failed, it always resulted in far fewer deaths and destruction to infrastructure. And within 5 years after, even if it failed, it was more likely to result in a healthy democracy. And so I think we've lost our creative minds to imagine any way other than the hammer, you know? When we put so much money into military spending, the solution to every conflict we start to think is a military solution. Kind of like the statement, if all you have is a hammer, everything begins to look like a nail, right? And so I wonder, what would it have looked like to respond nonviolently in Ukraine? And I think about, you know, Russia's greatest strength was, and it is their military strength, they got nuclear weapons, right? And at the beginning of the conflict, you might remember how much talk there was about Russia's greatest weakness, with the lack of support that Putin had for the war, right, among his own people. You don't hear that anymore. But what if we had attacked Russia's greatest weakness with the Ukrainian people's greatest strength? Their greatest strength was their passion for their home country. And what if they attacked that greatest weakness of Russia by telling Russian soldiers as they came in, we refuse to kill, you are our brothers and sisters, put down your weapons, right? Would they have lost what little support Putin had? Do you see how, like, you just need to think about that?
That did take place because there were Russian soldiers that defected north of Kiev.
Yep.
You know, but then it went away.
Yeah, because if there's any fighting or killing of Russian soldiers, Putin was able to use that. And so now you don't hear about a lack of support for the war in Russia very much anymore, right? And that's where I think nonviolence could have been great. I actually had a dream early on. This was when the caravan, miles long caravan of Russian tanks was outside of the capital city, right? And they would have had to cross a bridge to get in. And in my dream, it was me and Pope Francis. But and a number of other church leaders, right? We chained our ankles across the bridge. It made a barricade so the tanks would have to bulldoze us over, right? And the barricade, though, was a dining table that stretched all the way across and had food and water. And we had a banner in front of the table that just said, "We refuse to be enemies." And in my dream, it happened both ways. The one way it didn't work and we got killed. And then the other way, they got out of the tanks and they came and we just talked, right? You know, but hey, we follow a savior who was crucified. It doesn't always work. It's not always effective, but we're called to be faithful more than we are effective, right? But like Chenoweth and Stephen said, it does tend to actually be the most effective way to bring about peace. But not always. Sometimes we'll get crucified. How's that for a last word?
It's a great last word, and I just want to remind you that Jason has graciously agreed to sell books at his own cost. So if you're interested, talk to Jason afterward. I'm gonna go put my dress on for the 10:30, but really, really grateful that you joined us and for your work. I really.
Yeah.